desperately trying to hold back tears. A helpless child, was struggling in the freezing water. Emily Richardson, only 9 years old, was being pulled under by the current. The scene that had once been a lively weekend gathering for the affluent Richardson family had become a nightmare in a matter of seconds. But no one had seen the dog. In the midst of the panic, he charged straight into the frigid water, cutting through the current with surprising strength. It was as if he had no fear, no hesitation, as he fought against the cold waves to reach the drowning girl. "Get that filthy thing away from my daughter!" Richard Richardson screamed, his expensive suit soaked from the waist down as he stood frozen at the water's edge. But the dog, undeterred by the man's commands, dragged Emily toward the shore, pulling her by the collar of her jacket. Each stroke was filled with strength, fueled by a force that went beyond simple survival. The dog didn't care about the muddy waters, the filthy shore, or the disdain from the rich family. All he cared about was saving this girl from certain death. When the dog finally pulled Emily onto the safety of the beach, she clung to him, sobbing into his fur. She was safe. The dog, despite his injuries, stood guard beside her, trembling but resolute. He had done what no one else had done. He had saved a life. But as Emily's family quickly whisked her away, wrapped in expensive blankets, the dog was forgotten. His heroic act was dismissed. The rich, after all, didn't need him. The Richardson family filed a complaint about the dangerous mutt near the lake. They made no mention of the dog's bravery, of the life he had saved. They only saw a filthy stray, a liability, and no one in Millbrook, Connecticut, could have known how this one act of courage would change the lives of many, especially for a boy who would soon learn the true meaning of worth. The Thompson family's apartment was modest, nothing like the sprawling estate of the Richardsons. Sarah Thompson stood at the kitchen sink, her hospital scrubs stained with the remnants of a long, exhausting shift. The quiet hum of the apartment was a sharp contrast to the chaos she'd just witnessed at the lake. Her son, Jacob, sat at the small kitchen table, his eyes focused on his report card, the smile on his face a desperate attempt to cover his growing discontent. "You've kept your end of the bargain, honey," Sarah said, forcing a smile despite her exhaustion. "And I'll keep mine. We'll start looking for your dog this weekend." Jacob's eyes brightened at the mention of the dog, but his voice was filled with hesitation. "Mom, Michael Richardson got a new dog yesterday. A purebred golden retriever from some fancy breeder in Vermont. It cost more than your car. Everyone at school's talking about it." Sarah's heart sank, but she kept her composure. She had no way of giving Jacob the kind of life Michael had. She couldn't give him the perfect dog or the perfect anything. Since losing her husband in a construction accident 3 years ago, Sarah had become a master at stretching every dollar, trying to make life seem stable despite the constant worry that hovered over their heads. But even though she knew this, the weight of Jacob's words, that sense of shame at being the poor family, cut deeper than any financial worry could. The world they lived in was defined by status, by image. And Sarah knew that no matter how hard she worked, there was a chasm between their lives and the lives of the Richardsons. Michael had everything: money, prestige, status, and now a perfect dog to match. Saturday morning arrived with a chill in the air. Sarah Thompson's old Honda Civic sputtered as it pulled into the cracked parking lot of the Millbrook Animal Shelter. The engine groaned in protest, as if reluctant to take her on yet another trip to a place that never seemed to offer what they truly needed. Jacob sat in the passenger seat, his face pressed against the window, his eyes reflecting disappointment. The shelter before them looked nothing like the fancy pet stores Michael Richardson had boasted about at school. There were no marble floors or fountains in the lobby, no luxury. Just a dilapidated building that looked more like a forgotten warehouse than a place for hopeful pets. "Mom, this can't be right," Jacob said, his voice tight with dissatisfaction. Michael's family got their dog from a place with marble floors and fountains. This looks like a dump." Sarah sighed, but there was a quiet resignation in her expression. "Jacob," she said softly, "we talked about this. A good dog isn't about where it comes from or how much it costs. Your father's dog, Her voice trailed off as the old wound opened again. Her husband, David, had brought their family comfort in ways money could never buy. Now he was gone, and she was left with only memories and a worn-out car that barely ran. I don't want to hear about Dad's dog again. Jacob snapped, his voice sharp. His anger wasn't just about the dog. It was about everything he felt he was missing, the things Michael had, the life that felt out of reach. That was different. We weren't the poor family then. The word poor hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Sarah clenched her fists around the steering wheel, her wedding ring catching the morning light. It was the only piece of jewelry she hadn't sold to keep them afloat. She hadn't wanted to feel poor, not in front of Jacob. But that was exactly what they were. And Jacob knew it. Inside the shelter, Linda Martinez, the veteran manager, was just finishing her rounds when she heard the car pull up. She recognized Sarah Thompson from the lake incident, though she doubted Sarah remembered her. The ER nurse had seen hundreds of patients since that day, but Linda's eyes drifted to Boots' kennel as she passed. The injured dog had been there for 2 months, his past a mystery, his paw wrapped carefully in bandages. But something about him always stood out, his quiet dignity, the way he watched the door every evening at exactly 6 o'clock, as if waiting for someone who would never return. The doorbell jingled as Sarah and Jacob entered the shelter. The air was filled with the scent of damp fur, bleach, and the quiet hum of overhead lights. Dogs barked and whined, each one hoping for the chance to find a new home. But Jacob wasn't looking at the dogs. His gaze was fixed on the floor as he walked, his face flushed with embarrassment. He was used to being the boy who didn't belong here. Before Sarah could say anything to reassure him, a sleek Range Rover pulled up outside, its tires crunching against the gravel. Margaret Richardson stepped out, designer heels clicking on the pavement as she clutched adoption papers in her hand. The contrast between the two women was glaring. Sarah, in her simple scrubs, worn from years of sacrifice, and Margaret, in her perfectly tailored suit, holding the power to get whatever she wanted. Inside the shelter, the tension in the air thickened as Margaret approached the front desk, her tone dripping with disdain. "I wasn't expecting you today," Linda said, her voice professional as always, though she noticed the familiar edge to Margaret's words. "We've already processed Duke's papers," Margaret said, her voice tight. "But I've just found out from my vet that he's not quite the purebred golden retriever we thought he was. In fact, he's not really a golden retriever at all." Linda's eyes flicked to the file on her desk, her mind already working through the implications. "I assure you, Mrs. Richardson, all our documentation is accurate. Whether Duke's mixed ancestry doesn't change his value as a companion." But Margaret wasn't listening. "My son's reputation is at stake," she snapped. "The upcoming charity dog show is only weeks away, and I won't have him embarrassed by a mongrel." The word mongrel echoed in the room, sharp and cutting, making Sarah stiffen as she realized exactly what Margaret meant. She'd heard that same entitled tone too many times before. The same tone Margaret used to demand special treatment at the ER whenever she or her children needed attention. It was at that moment that a noise came from the back of the shelter, a distinct rattle that cut through the tension. Boots had risen to his feet in his kennel, his injured paw held slightly aloft. His eyes were fixed on the group before him, and for a moment, it felt as if the whole room had paused. There was something about Boots' gaze, something dignified, powerful, and full of silent challenge, that seemed to speak directly to the idea of value Margaret was so focused on. "Mom," Jacob whispered, his voice now a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity. "Is that the dog that saved Michael's sister?" But before Sarah could answer, Margaret turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. "Sarah, what a surprise," she said, her smile suddenly stiff. "Surely you're not thinking of adopting. In your situation?" The word stung, but Sarah forced herself to stay calm. Before she could respond, another voice broke the tension. It was Michael, his voice tight with worry. "Mom," Duke's shaking. "He won't stop, and he won't eat the food we bought." His face was no longer the confident boy from school, but one of genuine concern. Linda quickly moved to examine Duke. "These are stress symptoms," she said, her tone neutral, very common in puppies from certain breeding environments. But Margaret, ever the perfectionist, was already on the move. We didn't come here for medical advice, Linda, she said, her voice laced with cruelty. Let's just get this over with. It was in that moment, as Jacob watched Boots' calm demeanor in stark contrast to Duke's trembling fear, that something shifted inside him. He had been embarrassed to even step foot in the shelter, ashamed of the way things were. But now, watching the calm dignity of this dog, this shelter dog, no less, he saw something real. Something that had nothing to do with price tags or pedigrees. Jacob opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Margaret turned to leave. "We're done here," she declared. The decision to adopt a dog had been a turning point for Jacob. It wasn't just about finding a pet. It was about finding something that didn't carry a price tag. After the scene at the shelter, he had spent days thinking, reflecting on the quiet dignity of Boots, the shelter dog who had saved Emily's life. But Jacob didn't have the courage to admit it to himself, much less to his mother. Yet, Saturday morning, the day after their visit, he found himself standing at the front door, a mix of excitement and doubt swirling inside him. Sarah had made good on her promise. They were going to look for a dog. But Jacob couldn't shake the feeling that the decision was more than just about him. It was about redemption, about something deeper than the simple need for a pet. "Mom, I'm sorry," Jacob said, his voice quiet as Sarah was about to open the car door. "I didn't mean to act like that at the shelter." Sarah paused, her hand on the door handle, surprised by his sudden apology. She didn't know how to respond. She had tried to do her best for Jacob, but it had been hard to keep up the illusion of normalcy. The weight of the world had often felt too much to carry alone. "Jacob," she said softly, turning to him, "it's okay. I understand. It's not always easy." Together, they drove to the shelter again. This time, Jacob's face was different. No longer clouded with shame or bitterness. It was filled with an unexpected curiosity. Curiosity about the dogs who had been left behind. As they entered the shelter, Sarah immediately recognized Linda Martinez standing by the reception desk. Boots' kennel was visible in the back, and Sarah couldn't help but notice the quiet grace in the dog's eyes. Even from this distance, Linda noticed them right away. She smiled warmly, though there was a flicker of sadness in her eyes. "Back again?" she asked. "Did you change your mind?" "I think so," Jacob said, his voice uncertain but filled with something more honest. "I want to see Boots." Sarah looked at her son, seeing the change in him. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel the weight of his disappointment in her. She smiled, the corners of her eyes crinkling with pride. "Okay, let's see him." Linda led them to Boots' kennel, where the dog stood up as they approached, his injured paw held slightly off the ground. His eyes locked onto Jacob's, and for a moment, everything else faded. There was a quiet recognition between them. "Boots," Jacob whispered, his heart pounding in his chest. The dog's eyes never left him, the steady gaze reminding him of the dog's quiet dignity. The kind of dignity that he had been lacking for so long. For a boy who had spent so much of his life seeking validation from the wrong places, the connection with this humble dog was a revelation. Linda watched them both, her smile tinged with sadness. "He's a special dog, Jacob, not just because of what he did for Emily, but because of who he is. He's been through so much, and he's still here. He's still fighting." Jacob turned to her, something in his chest loosening. I think I get it now. He's not just some mutt. He's a hero." Linda nodded. "He's a hero. All right. And he's looking for someone who sees him for what he truly is." Jacob knelt down in front of Boots, reaching through the bars of the kennel, gently stroking his fur. Boots responded by resting his head against Jacob's hand, a quiet trust in his eyes. This wasn't about pedigree or bloodlines. It was about love, about sacrifice, and about understanding that true worth was never defined by the circumstances in which you were born. Suddenly, the air seemed to shift. There was no longer any hesitation. No more shame or regret about being the poor family. All that mattered was the bond forming between them. "I want him," Jacob said, his voice steady. "I want Boots to come home with us." The weeks following Jacob's decision to adopt Boots marked the beginning of a quiet transformation. At first, it was just the simple joy of having a dog that didn't care about pedigree, didn't care about status. He was just there, loyal and constant. Jacob spent every free moment at the shelter, helping with Boots' rehabilitation, learning more about the dog's past, and slowly unraveling the story that would change everything for him and for his entire community. One afternoon, as Sarah drove him to the shelter after school, Jacob seemed different. His eyes, which had once carried a certain embarrassment, now held a quiet determination. Something had shifted inside him. The world wasn't just about the status symbols and the things people chased. It was about finding what mattered, and Boots had shown him that. The shelter's usual hum greeted them as they entered. Boots was lying in his kennel, but when Jacob approached, the dog's ears perked up. He rose, his injured paw lifting slightly, and he greeted Jacob with the same calm presence he had shown from the beginning. "Hey, boy," Jacob whispered, his voice filled with warmth. "How are you feeling today?" But as Jacob stroked Boots' fur, a conversation taking place just down the hall caught his attention. He could hear voices, familiar voices, voices that sent a ripple of unease through him. "Linda, you can't just let them do this." Margaret Richardson's voice was sharp, filled with frustration. "I've made enough donations to this shelter. If you don't remove that dog from the lake area, I'll make sure your shelter doesn't get another penny." Jacob froze, his hand stilling on Boots' head. He had heard enough of Margaret's tone to know what it meant. It meant power. It meant control. And it meant that Boots' life had been in danger once before, not because of his actions, but because of the embarrassment he caused the Richardson family. "Mrs. Richardson," Linda's voice was firm, "I understand your concerns, but Boots saved your daughter's life. He deserves respect, not dismissal. Respect." Margaret scoffed, her words dripping with disdain. "Respect is earned, Linda. And that dog, he's just a stray. A mutt. He's a liability." Jacob's heart pounded in his chest as he listened to their conversation unfold. He knew what this was about. Margaret didn't care about the dog's bravery. She didn't care about the life he had saved. All she cared about was her image. And now, the dog who had been a hero was being threatened. Not because he had done something wrong, but because he had done something right. Jacob stood up quickly, shaking off the unsettling feeling that was spreading through him. He couldn't just sit there and listen. He couldn't let this happen. He had already watched one family, his own family, suffer from the damage caused by social pressures, and now he saw the same thing happening to Boots. A hero dog, discarded for the sake of reputation. "I'm going to find out what really happened," Jacob muttered under his breath. Boots looked up at him, as if sensing the change in his demeanor. Jacob turned to the door and walked toward the front desk, where Linda was speaking with another staff member. He needed answers. He needed to understand why the dog who had saved Emily's life was being treated like this. Linda looked up when she saw him approach, her face betraying a mix of surprise and caution. "Jacob, what's going on?" "I need to know more about Boots," he said, his voice more determined than ever. "Why did they want him removed from the lake? Why was he being treated like a problem?" Linda sighed, her shoulders slumping slightly as if the weight of the past was finally catching up with her. "I can't tell you everything, Jacob, but I can tell you this. Boots wasn't just any shelter dog. He wasn't just some mutt. His past, it's complicated." Jacob's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Linda looked around, making sure no one was within earshot. "Boots wasn't always Boots," she said softly. "He was once a service dog, a Coast Guard rescue dog. His real name was Admiral. He was trained to save lives, to rescue people from drowning." Jacob's heart skipped a beat. Boots, Admiral, had been a hero even before he saved Emily. His past wasn't one of neglect and abandonment. It was one of service and honor. But why would they want to get rid of him? Jacob asked, the pieces slowly beginning to fall into place. Linda's voice dropped to a whisper. After his injury, Crystal Pine's breeding company took him in. They saw his bloodline and thought they could breed him for profit. But when he couldn't perform, they abandoned him. He escaped, and the Richardsons, well, they invested in Crystal Pines. They didn't want their reputation to be stained by a dog like him, a dog who didn't fit the perfect image. The truth hit Jacob like a punch to the gut. The dog who had saved Emily's life, who had risked everything in that icy water, had been thrown away because he didn't meet some arbitrary standard of worth. He wasn't a purebred. He wasn't what the Richardsons wanted. Jacob's mind raced as he processed everything Linda had told him. Boots wasn't just a stray. He was a hero who had been discarded because of something beyond his control, something that had nothing to do with his heart, his bravery, or his soul. It had everything to do with status. The storm clouds that had hung over Millbrook for weeks finally began to clear, but the weight of the changes that had occurred could still be felt in the air. The once carefully constructed barriers of social status and reputation were crumbling piece by piece as the truth about Boots, about Admiral, unfolded. Emily Richardson, her eyes now clearer, sat at the kitchen table, her thoughts consumed by the dog who had saved her life. She remembered the cold water, the frantic screams, and the desperate fight to survive. But amidst all that chaos, she could still remember his eyes, the eyes of a dog who wasn't afraid, who wasn't concerned with anything other than saving her. It wasn't just that day at the lake. It was everything that had led to that moment, and everything that had followed. And now, the truth was out. The community that had once worshipped perfection and pedigree was learning that there was something far more valuable than bloodlines and status. True courage, true loyalty, and an unwavering spirit. As the days passed, Emily, Jacob, and their families found themselves sitting side by side in the waiting room of the Millbrook Veterinary Clinic. Boots had been stable for several days, but the wounds he had carried, both physical and emotional, were slow to heal. But there was something in the way he lay there, his eyes steady and calm, that told everyone he would make it. He would survive. In that same waiting room, Sarah Thompson sat beside her son, her hand resting gently on his. Jacob, who had once believed so strongly in status and the false importance of pedigree, had changed in ways he hadn't even fully understood himself. He was no longer the boy who had been embarrassed to step into the shelter, no longer the boy who had sneered at the idea of a mutt. He had learned, through the love of a dog who had known nothing but hardship, that worth wasn't determined by where you came from or who your parents were. Worth was about what you did, how you loved, how you fought, how you stood up for what was right. At that moment, Sarah glanced around the room. The tension that had once defined their lives, the social boundaries that had separated them from others, were slowly melting away. The Richardsons, once the epitome of power and prestige in Millbrook, now sat on the other side of the room, their family clearly broken. Margaret sat with her hands tightly clasped, her face pale. Richard Richardson, usually so composed, now looked lost, like a man who had finally been forced to face the consequences of his actions. The truth had been exposed. The shelter dog they had once tried to have removed from the lake, just a liability they had called him, was the very dog who had saved Emily. And that dog had changed everything. Boots, the dog they had dismissed, had become a symbol of something far greater than any status symbol or social expectation. Finally, the door to the treatment room opened, and Sarah stood, her medical training kicking in as she rushed toward the team of doctors. The clinic's fluorescent lights flickered as she entered, but inside, there was a sense of quiet urgency. Boots was struggling. His heart rate had dropped, and despite the progress he had made, the sedatives from Crystal Pines still haunted him, compromising his ability to fully recover. But Sarah wasn't going to let this happen, not after everything Boots had endured. She had watched him save a life, seen him fight for something greater than himself. And now, she was going to fight for him. "He's not giving up," Sarah said to the doctors, her voice firm. "We're not giving up on him. He's stronger than this." As a medical team worked to stabilize Boots, the waiting room was silent except for the sound of Jacob's steady breathing. He had learned, in these last few weeks, that nothing worth having came easily, and nothing that truly mattered could be measured in dollars or designer labels. It was about the heart, the soul, and the courage to stand up for what was right, even when it seemed like the world was against you. As the hours passed, the storm outside began to subside, and slowly, word spread. The community was starting to understand. The once pristine image of the Richardsons was crumbling, but in its place was something more powerful, a community united by truth, by redemption, and by the recognition that sometimes the most extraordinary things come from the most unexpected places. Finally, Sarah emerged from the treatment room, her face tired but filled with hope. Boots had made it. He was going to be okay. He had fought through the pain, through the betrayal, and through the darkness, and now he was going to heal. As Jacob stood up, his heart swelling with emotion, he turned to Emily, who had quietly stood beside him throughout the ordeal. "I think he deserves a real family now," Jacob said softly, his voice filled with gratitude. Emily smiled, her eyes filled with tears. "He's always been part of the family. We just didn't know it until now." And as the storm clouds began to clear, so did the fog of confusion and division that had hung over Millbrook. The community, once divided by status and reputation, now stood together, united by the true heroism of a dog named Boots. This story reminds us that true nobility doesn't come from bloodlines or pedigree. It comes from what we do, how we act in the face of adversity, and the heart we put into everything we do. Boots' journey was one of survival, redemption, and transformation. And through his eyes, we learn that worth is measured by courage, loyalty, and the unwavering commitment to doing what's right, no matter the cost. What do you think of Boots' journey and the lessons we can learn from his story? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the HeartForce channel for more heartwarming tales of change, healing, and transformation through the love of dogs.